Well, everyone, welcome to another edition of the DC Capstone Report. We've been out for a while on hiatus, and it's that time of year again. Alabama football is back, and we're ready to have our weekly podcast up. So we're thankful for you tuning in. Lance and I both are always thankful for our listeners who chime in and talk. And we have heard even this week some people saying, hey, when's the podcast coming back? So this is it. This is the first podcast on Alabama football. And here at the DC Capstone Report, we try to give you a unique perspective on Alabama football. And this is the week. Get started. And players reported yesterday. Today will be our first chance to hear from Coach Saban at the afternoon press conference and have our first practice under our belts by the time you're listening to this podcast. And so today on the podcast, first of all, let me thank Lance Shores for being the production person. He does a great job producing this podcast, and he's my partner in this. And I want to tell you always, if you can check out his websites at freelancepictures.com and rolltidebama.com for some great Alabama content. Well, here on the podcast today, folks, we got a big treat in hand. We're going to break it down in our three segments as we usually do, but today we have a special guest on the podcast, and you'll get to hear from him a little bit later. His name is Kennington Smith. Kennington is the Alabama beat writer for The Athletic, a great publication, online publication that covers great sports across our nation. And Kennington Smith is the new Alabama beat writer, and he's going to be with us throughout the entirety of the podcast. So in the first segment today, we're going to introduce you to Kennington. You'll get to know who he is, and he'll talk about how he got to Alabama. He has a great history in his background that sets him up for an opportunity to cover Alabama, as we all expect he will do such a great job. Already some of his articles have been some of the best that I've read on Alabama football. So we'll get you a chance to introduce me in the first segment. In the second segment, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about his opinion or his view of the overall culture of Alabama football. He's done a great article talking to some other former players, and he has a great view on that. In our third and final segment today, we're going to come down and break it down to some players to watch, some storylines to watch as we prepare for this fall practice session and for this year of a great season for Alabama football.
You're listening to the DC Capstone Report. The DC Capstone Report is featured each Tuesday morning on the Martin Houston Show at Tide 100.9. You can listen live at Tide100.9.com.
Well, welcome back to the DC Capstone Report. It's good that you've tuned in with us again today. We thank you for doing that. So here in the first segment, we're going to talk to and introduce you to Kennington Smith. Kennington Smith, as I said earlier, is the beat writer for The Athletic. He does a great job. He's just come on here recently, and he does a great job. I love the articles that he's written, and I want to just introduce yourself. So, Kennington, just say hello to our listeners out there and introduce yourself a little bit here.
Yeah, well, thank you to everybody for tuning in. Thank you for having me on the show. Like you said, Kennington Smith, full name, Kennington Lloyd Smith III. I've only been out here for a few months. I started in early May. This was when my first article came out. So it's been a little bit of a slow burn to start. Coming in the summertime, there's not a lot going on, but from what people on the beat have told me and yourself, it's like kind of enjoy that downtime while you can, because when it starts, it's like it's full speed. So
it is, and you've come in at a great time because you've got to get your feet wet in some of the off-season things, and realistically, really this year has not been a very big thing for off-season. That's a good thing. You don't have a lot of issues that's come up, but tell the listeners a little bit about your background, where you came from as far as you originated, and where you came from immediately before you came to Alabama.
Yeah, so I'm an Atlanta, Georgia native, so I'm from the SEC footprint. So growing up watching Alabama and the dynasty that Saban has built, really just a fan of the SEC in general. I went to the University of Georgia where I majored in mass media. Graduated from there, got a job with USA Today covering high school sports in South Carolina. From there, I was able to win a couple of awards. I did a few appearances on the Paul Feinbaum Show in 2020 and kind of got discovered, I guess you could say, from doing those appearances, and got a job in Iowa with the Des Moines Register covering the Iowa Hawkeyes football and men's basketball team. So I did that in 2021 and 2022 and was hired by The Athletic to cover Alabama. So that's kind of how I've gotten here and just kind of my path and really excited to be on the beat and to be covering Alabama at a time like this. And I think this season is just going to be really fascinating.
And really, you've got the background of the SEC, so you're familiar with the SEC. You know the footprint, you know all the teams, and you know what it's like. So you didn't come in with blinders on. You knew what it was going to be like covering Alabama football, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was so funny kind of going to the Midwest and being in Big Ten country for a few years, because outside of the South, there is a bit of a resentment from other regions of the country because of the SEC's moniker of it just means more, but it truthfully does. I mean, there is no other conference where there is pressure to win like the SEC, and that doesn't just include Alabama and the Georgias and the LSU. I mean, there's pressure all over the conference to consistently win and perform at a high level. When you think about the fan bases, I was just at SEC Media Days, and there were hundreds of fans in the lobby that came to Nashville just to see the coaches and the players walk through the lobby, not for autographs, not for a meet and greet, literally just to watch Nick Saban go up the escalator for a few seconds. There's no other conference in the country where the fandom is that strong to where people would do something like that. So to be in this conference at this time, and there's going to be conference expansion, and the SEC is just in a place right now where it is the best football conference, and they're in a position to continue to take a step forward and kind of like furthering the gap. So really exciting to be back here, and I understand what it means to be here, and I take my job very seriously. So I want to make sure that I'm putting out the best content for the fans, and I welcome all conversations with fans, all feedback, story ideas, anything like that.
Well, one thing you'll find out is Alabama fans are passionate, and I know you know that coming in, and you got to experience it in Nashville. My producer, Lance Shores, he is kind of situated out of Hoover, Alabama. So for a long time, the media days was in Hoover at the Winfrey Hotel. And Lance could tell us story after story of, if you thought it was passionate in Nashville, you should have seen all the fans that come to the Winfrey Hotel. And that's really the motto of the SEC. It just means more. It's truthfully not just for Alabama, it's for every SEC school. It does mean more for their fans, and that's who listens to our podcast. The Alabama fans who are fanatics about the program, wants to know more and inside information, that sort of thing. And I know you give that in your articles, but before we get into those in the other segments, just kind of a big helicopter view of the SEC. What's your take on the expansion? I know we got Oklahoma and Texas coming in. Where do you think we sit today? Is that where we're going to end, or is there another place we're headed in the SEC?
Yeah, I think for now the SEC is in a really good place where they can kind of sit and watch what's happening. You look at these other conferences that are making these moves, a lot of it is reactionary based on what the SEC did. They were the first ones who really kind of made the quote-unquote power move of adding Texas and Oklahoma, and then from there all the other Power 5 conferences are thinking to themselves, okay, what can we do to make ourselves viable when playoff expansion comes, and we want to have as many teams in the league, in the playoffs as possible. So I think the SEC is fine right now with, I believe it's going to be 16 teams.
16.
And I know that there's talk about, Florida State and Clemson and wanting to get out of the ACC deals, but the SEC, they're in a place of power to where they don't have to go and seek out a Florida State or a Clemson. They don't have to kind of meddle in those affairs to try to pull them into the conference. They are the prize. So they're just going to sit back and see what these other schools are doing to try to get themselves out of the deal. And if they do so, then the SEC can kind of extend an invitation. But they're not out actively searching like a Big 12, for example, that's just trying to load up on as many teams as possible to try to stay viable, or like the Pac-12 that's trying to keep their conference together. I think the Big Ten is in a good place as well, and I know that they're possibly looking at adding more teams, but they're kind of like the SEC as well, where they didn't really have to seek out anyone. So I think for now the SEC is good at 16 teams, but you never say never in this era of expansion, but I don't think any changes are imminent.
And I think some things you said early on about the outside people looking in really don't appreciate the SEC as much, especially when the Big Ten conference teams and others, maybe some of the Pac-12. And I think the Big Ten has done a good job of positioning themselves with the Pac-12 and getting the big schools like USC and UCLA. And now I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't go after Clemson and Florida State to try to get into the Southeast footprint. They got to make a decision. Are they going to be nationwide? Or are they going to be East Coast, West Coast, and whatever that'll all shake out? But I think the expectations for other schools sometimes is they don't really understand the SEC and the passion that the fan bases bring, or the competition that every school is in the SEC. And I know that's something that you've looked at before, but I had a unique perspective this past week. I was in Austin, Texas, right there in the belly of the enemy that's coming into Bryant-Denny Stadium second week. You know, Texas is coming in. So I had an interesting, and I'm going to tell you this little discussion that I had with several fans there. And the Texas people, they believe that they're coming in, everybody I talked to, they're going to come in dominating the SEC, that the SEC is nothing compared to that. And I thought maybe it was just some fans saying it, but it wasn't just one fan, it was multiple fans that I spoke to while I was there. And then you hear their coach came out that used to coach in the SEC, the Jeff Banks, I think it was this week. He made an offhanded comment in a media day that said going into Alabama is just like going into Kansas or Iowa State, just another road game. Well, you and I know that's not just another road game. And
right.
Later we see where his media relations cut that out and didn't send that portion out to their media. So I think sometimes we get some unrealistic expectations of what's going to take place from outside to inside the SEC. I happened to be on the same discussion, and there was an Oklahoma fan there. And after this the Texas fan had said they were going to come in and dominate the SEC, the Oklahoma fan said, hey, just pump the brakes a little bit. You have to understand Texas fans have unrealistic expectations. And he said they can't even dominate the Big 12. What makes them think they're going to dominate the SEC? I think Oklahoma fans, I'm not saying they're right, but at least they've had some experience. They've played at Georgia. They've played at Alabama. They've played some people in the SEC footprint, and at least have a respect for that. Do you think that the overall position that the SEC has placed themselves in now is advantageous, kind of like the Big Ten? In other words, they don't have to go out and seek other teams. They just have to sit back and watch and see what takes place on the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think about the SEC, even without Texas and Oklahoma, in a playoff expanded era, how many teams could they fit into the playoffs in any given year in a 12-team format?
Yeah.
If you look at how the conference looks at this moment right now, Georgia and Alabama there would probably never be a year where either of them miss a 12-team field. LSU would be in the mix. Auburn, Florida, Tennessee, Texas A&M,
Ole Miss.
Mm-hmm. So they could fit, a lot of teams into an extended field. You add in Texas and Oklahoma, and it just adds to the depth of the conference. In terms of how they feel about themselves coming into the league, I think for Texas, that game last year against Alabama gave them a sense of confidence that they'll be able to come in and immediately make an impact, because they were huge underdogs in that game. It was a 1-point game. I believe they played Georgia a few years ago in the Sugar Bowl. That was a dominating win by them. So they're kind of looking at it from, okay, the last few times that we've played the powers that be in the SEC, we fared well. We have Steve Sarkisian. We're recruiting well. We're ready to kind of go in there and light the road on fire. Where, like you said, Oklahoma, they've had a few bumpy run-ins with some SEC teams, and they might not have as much confidence in Brent Venables as Texas fans have in Sark. And I think Oklahoma is extremely fortunate that the SEC nixed that opener against Georgia, because that would have been, I think, a wake-up call as well. But
certainly,
yeah, I don't. I think you have to kind of come in with confidence that you're going to kind of come in and make an impact. But I think you make an excellent point with Texas, especially. The pressure on them this year is extremely high, because for them to have this great roster in the Big 12, obviously isn't as good as the SEC. They were to not have the season that they were expecting to have in the Big 12. Maybe they don't make the Big 12 championship or win the conference coming into the SEC. Then you would have to kind of look at that program like, okay, couldn't dominate the Big 12. You had this great roster with back-to-back top 5 classes, didn't win the conference. How do you expect to come in and win the SEC, especially in a divisionless era?
That's
so it'll be interesting to see. I think that Week 2 game is it's obviously, I think it's the biggest non-conference game of the college football season, obviously Texas and Alabama. But I think in terms of swing games, in terms of how we perceive each of those programs, is going to have a major impact.
I agree with you 100%. I think we'll have time later on down the road to discuss that Texas game. But one thing I'll say now, I think Alabama has an advantage in the Texas game twofold. One, it's at home, and I respect Jeff Banks, but I don't appreciate his idea that it's the same going into Bryant-Denny Stadium as it is going to Kansas or Iowa State. That's not really true. I understand he may have been deflecting that. But the second thing is, having a big game early in the season, Coach Saban has had that for his tenure here. He's always had a kickoff classic. Somebody's played a big team. So he's used to getting teams ready for a big game. So being at home and the team, I think we'll hold our own against Texas. All right, so as we're getting closer here in our first segment, tell our listeners how they can follow you, how they can get in touch with you, how they can subscribe to The Athletic. I know it's a subscription based, but it's very reasonable. I'm a subscriber, so tell our listeners how they can read some of your content.
Yeah, so if you're looking at it from an internet browser, just theathletic.com. If you're looking at it from mobile apps, any mobile device, just The Athletic, 2 words. Download the app. We do have a subscription special right now, 50 cents a week for the first year. So, and I was a journalism major, not a math major, so I don't know how much money that is off the top of my head. That's hard to beat, though, right? Yeah, exactly, yeah. So 50 cents a week for the first year. Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, at Skinny Kenny _SKINNY KENNY 1_ at the end. Kennington Smith, KENNINGTON, last name Smith. So Google, Twitter, X, mobile apps, any preferred method, you'll be able to find me.
Well, I recommend each and every one of you go out there that listen today and follow Kenny on Twitter or X, as he says. Subscribe to The Athletic. I'm a subscription customer, have been for quite some time since they started. Actually, I was one that got in on the very ground floor. Great content. It's worth it. This is based on what I'm paying, I know it is a bargain to get 50 cents a week. So at least for the first year, go and get all the Alabama content you can get and soak it up. He's got some great articles. We're going to talk about those in our next segment. Well, as we end the first segment, I couldn't do this without some fine sponsors. I told you about RollTideBama.com and FreelancePictures.com. New sponsor this year, it's helping sponsor the DC Capstone Report, is Karen Cottingham, realtor right here in Tuscaloosa. She's with the Williams Group with Keller Williams. She's a great realtor, has an opportunity to show houses for you all across the state of Alabama, to list houses anywhere in the state of Alabama. So if you want to come, find that condo, find that place for game day here, she's the person to contact. You can contact Karen Cottingham at 205-887-4008. You can reach her on her website at www.karen.thewilliamsgroupal.com, and you can search all the inventory there that you have. If you'd like to email her, it's Karen Cottingham at kw.com. So one of our sponsors, we hope that all y'all reach out to her this time, and she's a great opportunity for us and great to partner up with her as she sponsors the DC Capstone Report. Well, welcome back to the second segment of the DC Capstone Report. Thank you for all our listeners out there. We have Kennington Smith with The Athletic with us all day today on the podcast, all podcast long. So here in the second segment, we're going to start talking about the overall culture of Alabama. But before we do that, Kenny, right before we went to the break there, we talked about our new sponsor, and it's off Karen Cottingham Realtor. It's we've never had actually a guest on the show who's actually used one of our sponsors like that. You had an experience with Karen Cottingham, I think, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said in the first segment, I was living in Iowa when I got this job, so I pretty much had to find a place down here in the Tuscaloosa area, sight unseen. And through my parents, we got connected with Karen, and just the way that she walked us through the entire process, especially with me being so far away, it just felt very seamless. I was comfortable throughout the process. I didn't have any anxiety about trying to find a place that fit what I needed and what I wanted, even though I wasn't there on hand. Walked me through every step. FaceTimed me multiple times. I'm up there in Iowa, like working. She's making sure that I'm seeing everything and I'm a part of the process, even though I was out of state. So I love where I live. I would recommend her to anybody, near or far, if you want somebody who's going to work as hard as they possibly can to find a place for you and make sure that you're comfortable throughout the entire experience.
Well, that's great. Kenny, thank you for talking about one of our sponsors, one of our new sponsors. And he's right. If you have a chance, check out Karen Cottingham, realtor here in town. And I want to commend you in this day and time of being able to work from anywhere remotely. I think it's important. I know there's not a national beat writers that write on Alabama football, but I think it's important to be here and ingrain yourself in the culture. And I commend you for moving to Tuscaloosa and uprooting yourself and getting involved in that. I don't know if it was an option for you to work from anywhere, but I know it is for a lot of folks today. So but being in part of the Tuscaloosa culture, I think, has helped you. And I think yesterday you were able to go to a charity event that the Knicks kids had, so you get to be part of that. Most people wouldn't get to just pop in for one of those. You got to do that. But I think you've also been able to get ingrained in some local people that have put you in touch with some former players and different things. So one of your articles I read talked about a little bit about that. Kind of get an overall picture of the Alabama culture. So our listeners want to know, is Alabama back to the Bama standard or not? And I know you've had a chance to look at that. That's something that we've been trying to get back to with the coordinator changes and with with Tommy Rees coming in as offensive coordinator and Kevin Thiel coming as defensive coordinator. It looks like we're heading in that direction, and everything I've heard Coach Saban speak about has been positive. I haven't heard any kind of negative coming out in media days. What's your impression after speaking to all of these players and just kind of seeing what's going on in media days and hearing what do you think about the Alabama culture, where it is right now? What position are they in before they start the season?
Yeah, the conversation about the standard and the culture is so interesting because I think a lot of times you think about the Bama standard as just winning, and that is one part of it, and ultimately that's the goal, but it is so much more than that. It's a style of play, it's a mindset, and I think those are the things that the team has kind of gone away from in the last few years. Style of play, not dominating at the line of scrimmage the way that fans are used to seeing. Penalties is a huge component of this, not being as disciplined. And I know Nick Saban last year, I forget which game it was, but he kind of talked about almost like a timidness in big moments with the team. Like he could feel an anxiety.
Yes.
There was like an anxiety in big moments, which can lead to mistakes and ultimately cost the team games, which we saw a few times last season. So in talking to the players, former players in the programs like the Greg McElroys, the Bear Joneses, the Jordan Battles, who was just on Bama's team last year, that is kind of where the focus is at, is identifying the leaders that are going to hold the players accountable and bring them back to a style of play that fans and media and the college football world at large has seen over the last 15 or so years under Saban. So I think that the team is in a good place right now in terms of the mentality. I think the messaging has stuck out to me a lot. The last few times that Nick Saban has spoken, he's spoken about talent is not an issue. Obviously at Alabama they've recruited better than anybody in college football since Saban has been there. But talent alone isn't enough. You have to have the right mindset. And with the right mindset comes with a sense of humility. And it's not always easy to instill humility at a program like Alabama, respectfully, because the team has just been so good every single year. And the media picks them to win the national championship often. They pick to win the SEC every year. And when you kind of buy into that we're better than everybody mentality, that's kind of when you can see the team not perform to the same standards. So he says that part of the team is on point. Talking to Greg McElroy, he said that he's been around the team a lot this offseason and he likes the messaging and he likes the approach of the team. So I think the mentality and how the team is approaching the season is in the right place, but ultimately they have to go out and execute that on the field. So I think returning to that standard and the team culture is one of, if not the biggest storyline on the team this year. Obviously, quarterback, coordinators, those things are question marks, but if the overall team, all three phases, are not playing up to a certain standard, then we're not going to see Alabama kind of return to the winning program that we've been accustomed to seeing under Saban.
And I when I heard the word anxiety out of Coach Saban's mouth, it was not something we'd ever heard before. So it was something our listeners, thinking, what our team players are anxious. And the old former players that I heard talk about that, like Jonathan Allen. I heard Jonathan Allen speak a little bit after that. He said, we never talk about being anxious. We never were anxious about when we went on the field. So something must be wrong. And I think you uncovered it. All of our listeners out there will look at last season and say it's just a lost opportunity. You got the best offensive player, best defensive player in the nation, and we don't even make it to the playoffs. And it can boil down to 2 games and 2 losses and maybe 1 or 2 plays in those games. But and it's kind of a missed opportunity. But I think you were talking to Jordan Battle off the team last year, and I think he was reading between the lines. I feel like he was saying that maybe one of the 4 prongs of Coach Saban's process being discipline, and discipline was really lacking on and he even thought we lost maybe the Tennessee game because of that. Can you speak to that? Because I think most people don't think that the Bama Standard is just beating everybody and, like you said, winning, but the process is more intricate than that. And if you don't buy into every portion of it, then you're off a little bit. So,
right. Yeah. The thing about Alabama is what we're accustomed to seeing is not only them having the best players, but it's hard to beat them not only because they have the best players and the best coach, but they don't beat themselves, right? They're going to play the right way and not have a lot of penalties and have a lot of turnovers. And I think it was 16 penalties against Tennessee. Those yards rack up. They come in crucial moments. They sway momentum, and it allows teams to stay in games longer. And when I was talking to Jordan Battle, he said that he felt like penalties and discipline were the reasons why they haven't won the national championship in the last few years. And that is something that we're just not accustomed to seeing out of an Alabama team. So that's something that I plan on asking Coach Saban is just in fall camp settings, what is the process of eliminating penalties, eliminating disciplinary mistakes in practice? Like, are the referees out there? Just kind of what is the strategy in terms of instilling that discipline early on? And it's going to be something that we watch for throughout the season. And it's not only Jordan Battle. J.C. Latham went at SEC Media Days when he was at his podium, said, we beat ourselves off of penalties last year. We beat ourselves off of discipline. And that's just, again, just very uncharacteristic. And that is frustrating to hear because with all of the disciplinary problems that they had on the field, I believe they led the SEC in penalties last year.
They did.
They still were just 2 plays away from an undefeated regular season. That lets you know how small the margins are, right? Like if Alabama cuts down their penalties in half, I don't know if they would have beat both Tennessee and LSU. They probably would have won one of those games.
And one loss gets you still in the playoffs.
Right, exactly. They would have had a chance, in the SEC championship, and who knows what would have happened in that game. But,
or if they'd have beat, Tennessee and maybe been even better going into LSU. You never know.
Right, exactly. So that's kind of what I'm going to be looking for this year. And then also you mentioned you lose the Bryce Young, you lose Will Anderson, who are going to be kind of like those next wave of leaders to step up. And what is going to be the identity of this team? I think for better or worse, last year's identity was the star power on the team. We have the best offensive player, the best defensive player. You could argue the 2 best players in college football. But I think, listening to Coach Saban in a few of his pressers, he felt like they might have been a little too reliant on star power. So what is this year's team identity going to be? Is it going to be more of a cohesive, complementary football type of unit, or are more, star players going to emerge and it's going to be more of a star-laden team? So I think all those questions are going to answer themselves this fall camp.
And in our last segment, we're coming up a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about players and get to that. But just as we close out this second segment, talking about discipline, I think some of our listeners may have a different definition of what that is, and I think it's Alabama. It's a little more deeper. We hear discipline. It's like disciplining a child, making them do what they're supposed to do. I don't think that's what Coach Saban's talking about. I don't think it's what Coach Jordan Battle's talking about. I think he's talking about the self-discipline in order to play within yourself. Coach Saban said you practice not to get it right. You practice so much that you can't get it wrong. And so when the game's on the line, when anxiety can swell up, when you're tired, when your mind's not all there, and you're in that last moment of crisis there, do you have the self-discipline to do what it takes to do the right thing for you and for your teammate? I think that's what Coach Saban has talked about sometimes in the media days, and I think even yesterday when he was asked a question, he kind of related to that kind of culture and of discipline. What do you think it take? What do you think it's going to take for Alabama this year to change that? I know you're going to ask that question, but what do you think it's going to take for Alabama to change the discipline, of course, as far as individual discipline for people?
Yeah, I think on a penalty side, it just comes down to personal accountability player to player, and it's going to come down to the leaders on the team establishing that the type of behavior of racking up a lot of penalties is just not going to be accepted. And something that stuck out to me, again, J.C. Latham, you could argue best player on the team, one of the top leaders on the team, said himself, I'll stand at the forefront and say I had too many penalties, right? So when you have the best players on the team taking that accountability and saying, you know what, it's not me sitting up here pointing down and saying, you had too many penalties, you had too many penalties. I had a lot of penalties that cost us, and I'm going to correct that. When you hear that person saying that, then you have to kind of fall in line as well and say, okay, I'm going to follow him on that same accord. And it goes even further beyond just penalties and turnovers. The Alabama secondary had a lot of defensive breakdowns last year that led to a lot of big plays. Again, things are just that are uncharacteristic of Alabama defenses. So it goes, even beyond penalties and turnovers. We talk about discipline. It's also staying disciplined within the scheme and disciplined within the play call to make sure that you're not beating yourself as well. So some of that is partly coaching with the addition of Kevin Steele, who understands the standard, right? He understands what Nick Saban is trying to do defensively. I think a lot of fans have a lot of confidence that they're going to kind of return to that more disciplinary style under him. Offensively, we'll see what happens with, Tommy Rees and kind of what he instills in terms of that type of play style. But I think it starts with accountability with the players, because at the end of the day, coaches and the messaging of the coaches can only go so far. If you're going to have a really good team, it has to be a player-led team, and there has to be investment and accountability from the players. So I think that's really where it starts, and I think the coaching is a little bit secondary in that regard. So I think both sides have to kind of work together, but it starts with the players taking control and ownership of that.
I agree 100%. I think the word you just used there is the word that goes right along with discipline. That's accountability. And I think that lacked on Alabama's team last year. I think individual accountability for what you do, when you do it, it lacked a little bit. And I think that was individual, but I think it also had a little bit to do with coaching. I think Pete Golding's style of coaching was not the same as Kevin Steele's. And I think Kevin Steele demands a little more accountability per individuals in order for them to play. So I think we're going to see an uptick this year. So very good, very good. As we close out this second segment, I think the two words we can leave with is discipline and accountability. Those two things change may be the difference between Alabama making the playoffs or not. All right, well, welcome back to the DC Capstone Report. We're here with Kennington Smith. We're with The Athletic. You can follow him at skinnykenny _ there on Twitter, or X, as you like to call it. But also take advantage of the wonderful opportunity to get in with The Athletic on this new sale going on for 50 cents a week for the first year. So read all of his content. One of the best writers that I've seen come on the scene here lately. I give him a great recommendation for you to follow him and to read his stories. One of the last stories I think that you wrote on Alabama was Alabama opens camp. You talked about 5 players and 5 storylines. So here in the third segment, we're going to dive in just a little bit on some players. I'll talk about some players that I want to spotlight, and some of the ones you spotlight may be a little different, but I think it's time now. Football's here, right? Practice starts today, and it's time to say, we've talked about the culture. We've talked about what we need to do. Now it's, can you do it on the field? And I think Coach Saban has really been a little, I don't know, called nice is the way. He's talked about a lot of good things. He hasn't been more disciplinarian. I haven't seen him have a rant yet. Hopefully you're not the first rant when you ask a question this afternoon at the press conference. But I think he's having fun. It seems like he's having fun a little bit. And I think he wouldn't be having that much fun if he didn't think that the culture had shifted a little bit. So I think we're going to see that. And I think some of the players that you've highlighted in your last article is the reason for that, because we've got some players that can really step up and be accountable. And you talked a little bit about already J.C. Latham at the media, but you've listed some more players, like 5 players to watch. Tell us a little bit about that. Who do you think we need to watch out? Who do our listeners need to watch for in the days ahead?
Yeah, so my thought process in this story was kind of not highlighting like the obvious storylines and players to watch. Like when you think about Alabama's team, like who's a player that we want to watch? Obviously, we want to watch the quarterbacks, right? So we're gonna take them out of it. Who are some of the other players that are going to make or break this season that aren't getting as much attention as the quarterback position? So I'll start with one in particular, Jaheim Otis, who is stepping into a major role at the interior of the defensive line. Huge position to fill when you think about, okay, losing DJ Dale, losing Byron Young, and the tradition of dominant interior defensive lineman at Alabama. He's the one who is going to be kind of stepping into that role and becoming a leader on the defensive line, even though he's only a sophomore in eligibility. And his role is increased, and so is his importance to the team because Jamil Burrows had left the team via the transfer portal. So you thought you had two reliable interior guys. Now you have one in Otis, and we're going to find out who's going to be those next guys in that rotation. But now the onus is really on him to take ownership of that position and to be a dominant force in the interior of the defensive line. So that was kind of the thought process of choosing players who I think could impact this year's team, and that was one of my top 5.
And I think Jaheim Otis is he flashed as a freshman, and I think he's poised to have a great sophomore season. Now, two guys I would say to look for on the defensive line are, number one, Tim Smith. He's a senior. Tim Smith has been there. He's 6'4", 302, plays a similar position of Jaheim Otis, but can also slide out to anywhere across the defensive line. So I look for him to make an impact this year. He's a product of Florida, been in the system for a long time. He's come up and watched a lot of been in rotation. He's had some playing time, but never had that flash. So I think that he has an opportunity to flash this year in that defensive line position. And somebody that some people aren't really talking about is a local Birmingham product. Now, we've had some really good Birmingham products, like Quinion Williams and different players that come out of Birmingham and flash on the scene. So look for a guy named Tim Keenan this year. He's a redshirt sophomore, 6'2", 338, and really played at Ramsey High School in Birmingham, local product. So I think he has a chance to be a contributor. So look for, as you said, Jaheim Otis, but also our listeners out there, watch for Tim Smith and Tim Keenan on defensive line. What about linebacker? I know I know everybody talks about our outside linebackers a lot, and Braswell and Dallas Turner. Dallas Turner, I thought he handled himself great at media days. He said the one thing that we all want to hear as Alabama fans, that's a joyless murder ball. He had the great comment that everybody picked up on, and that's what we want to hear. But I think the middle linebacking core is somewhere to look at, and I think you highlighted one of those linebackers in your story as well.
Yeah, Deontay Lawson, who was a backup last year, technically, with Jalen Moody and Henry To'o, and then when Moody got hurt, he was able to step into a starting role and really flashed in those last two games against Auburn and Kansas State. And I think it's somebody who, if he reaches the potential that and the expectations that people have for him, can be one of the better middle linebackers that Bama's had in the last several years. I mean, he has that type of athletic prowess. He has that type of potential. I mean, sideline to sideline, striker, good in pass coverage, aggressive, all of the things that you want in a prototypical middle linebacker in the Alabama system. I think he is a player to watch because for all the momentum that he had at the end of last season, he did miss spring practice recovering from a surgery. So he did miss a significant amount of time in which he really could have taken ownership of that middle linebacker spot. That doesn't mean that he's behind in some way, that he won't have a huge role on this year's team. In fact, I think he's going to be a central part of this defense, but his development in fall camp is going to be huge in terms of the success of Alabama's defense. That middle linebacker spot is one of the higher priority position battles on the team because he's going to fill one spot, and then there's newcomers in that position as well who's going to fill that other spot. There's returning players as well. So I'm looking at Deontay Lawson as somebody that, if he takes a step forward, that's going to go a huge way in returning Bama's defense to the quote unquote standard.
And I've heard some people, two people now, use a comparable here of somebody. I don't like to put this pressure on a guy like Lawson, but Dante Hightower, an Alabama linebacker who's had a longevity in the NFL, playing the middle linebacker spot, rushing the quarterback, covering pass. He can do it all, and so I think Lawson has those same qualities. Two guys I want to talk about a little bit. Maybe you can give me some insight on one of them. Is the transfers in. Everybody's talking about transfers. LSU transfer Justin Jefferson. He was flying around at spring practice and did some great things there. So everybody's talking about him. I think he's somebody to watch because he's new on the scene. How is he going to acclimate to fall practice, and where can he be in the pecking order? But somebody, I think, you being a Georgia alum, you probably know about Tresman Marshall, and that's somebody that I haven't heard a lot talking about, but some of the people who are on the inside have been telling me, hey, this guy's got flashes of brilliance. That maybe he was held back at Georgia because of some injuries and things, that he really wasn't his playing time. Tell me a little bit about Tresman Marshall.
Yeah, that's spot on. Tresman is somebody who was a highly touted linebacker prospect coming out of high school and looking at Georgia's inside linebacker history over the last several years, the Roquan Smiths, the N'Kobe Deans, Quay Walkers, etc., Tresman could have easily been in that playing rotation, but injuries have kind of held him back throughout his career. Whenever he was healthy, he was a rotation player, and he was an impactful player, particularly in pass coverage. So he's a linebacker that's going to work well in space. Obviously, coming in very experienced, he understands what it means to kind of come in and be a part of a championship team. I think whenever you welcome players via the transfer portal, wherever they come from, you have questions about, okay, are they going to fit the culture? Are they going to be able to kind of come in and meet the demands that we're going to put on them as coaches and as a conditioning staff? Are they going to fit the culture of what we're trying to do? You don't have to worry about that with Tresman, because he's coming from another program that's of elite caliber as well. And he was somebody who was an impactful player on that team. So
he knows the demands of a coach like Kirby Smart that's in the mold of Nick Saban.
Exactly. So I think that he's going to be, right there in the competition as well. I think, John Campbell is another player who's going to have something to say as well. So it could be potentially one of the deepest positions on the team. But I have high expectations for Tresman, and I'm wishing him good health this fall camp, because if he's healthy and he really gets a chance to get his feet up under him, I think that fans are going to like what he brings to the table.
That's great. Let's stay on the defensive side of the ball. One of the players that you highlighted is somebody that's very familiar with Alabama fans out there, on the people listening to our podcast. He's been in the system for a long period of time now. Started as a freshman, and that's defensive back Malachi Moore. Tell me why you picked him as one of your players.
Yeah, Malachi Moore was somebody who looked like he was on a 3-and-out first-round trajectory as a freshman. That COVID year, he came in and started every game up until he got hurt. He was looking like the next great Alabama defensive back, and then the last few years, his production has tailed off a little bit. Partly of that is injury, has kind of held him back, particularly in 2021. But the ascension of other players, Jordan Battle and Brian Branch and others, kind of halted his ability to be like that consistent starter. But he is one of the most consistent performers. He is a leader in the secondary, and I think the versatility that he brings, he could be a starting safety, he could be the starting star. He's the oldest back there in terms of playing time and experience, and I think that he's just somebody who's going to remind fans of what that 2020 year looked like, just with more experience. I think that it's kind of interesting or difficult to peg a player who has started for a full season and been a consistent contributor for 3 years as like a breakout player, but I just feel like he's due for like a really good senior season and potentially being like kind of one of those like good stories, somebody who started strong, maybe had some adversity in the middle, but closed out on a positive note. So I'm really excited to see what he does this year, and I think he's going to be a core part of what Alabama does this year.
And he has an opportunity to do what Coach Saban has always said players can do, create value for themselves. If anybody on that defensive side, he has a chance to really move up the board on the NFL draft boards by the way he plays this year. So I look for him to have big years too. Somebody else in the secondary that I've highlighted is Earl Little Jr. Earl Little Jr. had an awesome spring game. And the reason I highlight him is people kind of lost track of him last year. If our listeners remember, he came in as an all-world talent, and being the son of a former NFL player, Earl Little, and it was great that Alabama could get him. But injuries really set him back in last year. But even though he was injured early on, he recovered and came back and played in 3 games toward the end of the year, and really was a contributor in that last game against Auburn. So I think Earl Little Jr. is somebody that our listeners ought to watch for as well. He has the talent. He has a 5-star talent. I think he has the ability. And if he stays healthy, just like Tresman Marshall, I think he has a chance to break out this year and have a big side on the defensive side. Let's move to the offensive side of the ball. You highlighted 2 offensive players, and let's get right to the wide receivers, because wide receivers have gotten a bad rap last year at Alabama. They're dropping balls, and maybe not to be up to the standard we've had, but when we've had the standard of Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs and Devontae Smith and Amari Cooper and all these Calvin Ridley, all these players that have come and done so well, it's hard to say that these players aren't good. So we got a good group of wide receivers, but you've highlighted one of my favorites that I think everybody kind of slept on a little bit coming off last year. I thought you had a great freshman season. Tell us about who you highlighted on your article.
Yeah, Kobe Prentice. This receiving core is so interesting because you kind of like break them up into like tiers. You have like Corey Brooks, Jermaine Burton, like the upperclassmen who are going into like second year of like being starters and contributors, and you have Malik Benson is kind of in like a tier of his own as like incomer, high expectations, but we haven't seen enough of him to really know, which way it's going to go. And then you have this group of 4 rising sophomores of like Prentice and Isaiah Bond and Henderson and Kendrick Law. And I think, you're right. A lot of people are looking at Isaiah Bond and Kendrick Law to kind of like take that next step. But Kobe Prentice played the most of all of that group last year and showed a lot of promise. I think that his speed, I think his body control, yards after catch was probably what stuck out to me the most about him. So, you kind of referenced the pass guard of wide receivers, the wideouts. I know that Alabama fans affectionately know them as. I feel like Kobe Prentice is like built of that same. He's built that same mold. I think that he can kind of bring that right out feel to this core. So I'm really excited to see how he potentially breaks out with this group. I feel like he is a starter on this team in the slot, and I think him kind of taking that second year leap is going to determine a lot about the success of this year's team. And that was one of my storylines in my story is the second year players, that 2022 class. So many of them and their development is going to tell the story of this year's team, whether it's Prentice and the other receivers or Ty Simpson or Elijah Pritchett or Earl Little. A lot of these guys going into their second year, these rising sophomore class, that's a group that you should pay a lot of attention to in fall camp.
Correct. I agree with you 100%. I'll throw out there about Malik Benson. I think he has a chance to flash on. We don't know enough about him yet. But one thing I do know about him that gives me confidence is the Heisman, the number 1 pick in the draft selected him to catch passes from him at his pro day when he hadn't had much of a relationship with him. That lets me know he could catch the ball. Sure catch. So I think that he has a chance to jump out there. Lastly, on the offensive side of the ball, you went with the offensive lineman, and I think offensive linemen are near and dear to our listeners' heart. We want an offensive line that can dominate. All of our listeners always comment about we need to get back to Alabama and just running the ball, being able to, hey, we're going to run it here. We need to get 2 yards. We know we're going to run it here. But we're going to get those 2 yards anyway. That type of style. And you've highlighted one particular person, but J.C. Latham, you've talked a little bit about. I think he's going to be the bell cow that runs that offensive line. And Tyler Booker playing side by side, which they played at IMG Academy. If that duo, they have a chance to really impose their will on that side of the ball. And you throw in Seth McLaughlin, Darren Dallacourt, but you've highlighted that one person that's going to fill that other role. And it's a second-year player that you're talking about. Who is it?
Yeah, Elijah Pritchett,
Okay.
Highly touted prospect, redshirted last year, and that's the position. Whether left tackle, right, wherever he plays on the line, that's like the one position on the offensive line where there's not experience. Like J.C. Latham, entrenched starter, likely first-round pick, know what he's bringing to the table. Dallacourt, McLaughlin, veterans, steady. Tyler Booker's a sophomore, but he played a lot last year. You feel like you know what you're going to get out of him. Pritchett is the only one that really doesn't have significant game experience. And then behind him is Caden Proctor, true freshman from Iowa. So that's a position where you really need Pritchett to take a step forward and be a consistent, steady force at that left tackle spot, right tackle spot, wherever he's going to be on the outside of the offensive line. You really need him to take that step forward. And to your point, the offensive line is something that's near and dear to the fans' heart. And when you talk about the standard and a style of play and physicality, that's something that has waned in the last few years when you talk about Alabama's play at the line of scrimmage. So he's going to be a huge part of reestablishing that dominance. And that competition between him and Caden Proctor is also another one that I think is just of high priority. Obviously, the quarterback competition is going to be the most paramount, but when you look past that, that tackle position battle has to be in the top 5 of most importance on the team and what is going to partially tell the story of this year's team.
And Elijah Pritchett's great, and I think he has a great chance to really win that job, but I wouldn't sleep on Caden Proctor. You have a unique perspective because you covered Iowa. You knew it was a big deal for him to go to Iowa, and he's not just a he's not just another player. He's a 5-star player. He's a guy that. Tell us a little bit about what you know about Caden Proctor, and should we really watch this? Is it really going to be a battle?
Yeah, it is going to be a battle. Caden Proctor is an elite talent, potentially generational. I know that his player, if you look at recruiting sites and if you're into player comps, like his player comp was Trent Williams, who is a Hall of Fame tackle, still playing in the NFL. He has the size, has the speed, has the athleticism, highest ranked prospect to ever come out of the state of Iowa, and it was a huge recruiting win for Iowa. And on the other side of it, it was a huge recruiting loss, something that the fans are still not over, honestly, because he was supposed to come in and be an immediate impact starter and contributor on Iowa's offense this year. So to see him come to Alabama, I think that he recognized an opportunity to contribute right away after there was a bit of a mass exodus of offensive linemen in the portal at the end of last season. And you saw what he did in the 8-day scrimmage. I mean, he played really well. And when you listen to veterans talk about him, J.C. Latham, especially at Media Day, he was asked several times about Caden Proctor. He was very complimentary of him throughout. So he's somebody who has a really bright future at Alabama, and it could very easily be this year. I think that he does have potential to be an impact freshman.
And what our listeners need to remember here is we flipped a player from Iowa. People, well, that's just Iowa. No, Iowa has a history of putting NFL linemen, offensive linemen in the NFL for longevity of career. So when they identified him as a great player, I mean, in the state of Iowa, he really was head and shoulders above the rest of the players, I think. So that, as we close out our podcast here on the day, we've been talking to Kennington Smith of The Athletic, and his last article was a great article. I encourage you to go out and read it. But you had several storylines. Give us, as we close out, to give us one storyline that you think is going to be the storyline for our listeners to watch throughout fall camp.
Yeah, I think skill players, pass catchers is probably the number one storyline that I would watch out for, because it is directly tied to the quarterback. And Nick Saban said this at SEC Media Days is, yes, we do need to figure out who the starting quarterback is, but what is going to make his life easier and what's going to make life easier for our entire team is if the offense can elevate their level of play to make it easier for whoever the quarterback is going to be. And what's going to make Jalen Milroe, Tyler Buckner, Ty Simpson's life easier is if they have sure-handed, steady, explosive pass catchers. So what's going to happen at receiver? There's a lot of talented options, but who's going to emerge as consistent options? That's the key for that group, consistency. At tight end, you lose Cameron Latu, but you bring in C.J. Dipre as a transfer from Maryland. What is he going to bring to the table? And then past him, you have a lot of athletic options. There's a lot of athletic potential, but haven't seen those guys on the field in a capacity that you give confidence. But Tommy Rees loves tight ends. We saw that at Notre Dame. He has an affinity for using them. So who's going to emerge at that room, and are they going to be a focal part of the offense as well? So who are going to be the reliable pass catchers that's going to make life easier for the quarterback is the storyline that I would watch.
In the pass catching ability for tight end room, you can watch that C.J. Dipre. The Robbie Oots is there as well. But I like Amari Niblack, like Danny Lewis Jr. Those are two athletic players that would contribute as well. And something else that always makes a quarterback's job easier is running the ball. Yeah. Run the ball and play action passing. And we didn't get a chance to talk to him about it today, but Alabama has a really deep running back room this year. And I'm looking for another storyline. My storyline is watch that running back room and see how those 5 players shake out. You got Jace McCullough, Roydell Williams, and then you got Jamarian Miller, maybe have lost. He had a great year last year as well. You got Justice Haynes coming in, might be the best of all. And then we haven't even seen Richard Young. He's a 5-star talent coming in, and we'll get to see him in fall practice. So, well, another great podcast here on the DC Capstone Report. I appreciate all our listeners tuning in today, and I hope you would share this and get the information out. Our guest today has been Kennington Smith of The Athletic. I encourage you to go follow him on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, at SkinnyKenny _. And also take advantage of this sale that The Athletic's got going on for a year. First year, 50 cents a week. You can't beat that. 50 cents a week for the first year, and you can get all the great Alabama content that Kennington's going to be writing. He'll be later on this afternoon over at the press conference. He may get a chance to ask his first question, and you'll be able to follow him on Twitter or follow him on the Athletic. I'm sure he'll have a story coming out each week as we go through these upcoming days of fall camp. So again, King, thank you for being on today. I know I appreciate you all being on, but also our listeners appreciate you as well. I want to thank our sponsors, as always, RollTideBama.com, FreelancePictures.com. That's Lance Shores in the studio making all this happen today. Follow us on Twitter at DavidCott50. You can go to our website, www.dccapstonereport.com, or Facebook at the DC Capstone Report page. And I want to thank our sponsor, Karen Cottingham of the Williams Group here in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Keller Williams, great realtor. You can contact her at 205-887-4008. Karen Cottingham at kw.com for email, or you can go to our website at www.karen.thewilliamsgroupal.com and look at all the wonderful inventory. Check her out here, wonderful new sponsor of the DC Capstone Report. Well, this is DC signing off until next week. Look forward to having another great week back here on the podcast, same place, back here next time.